that have the virgin birth as a miracle that Jesus did. So see, these are some of the decisions you have to make. I opted that Jesus was born. He did not birth himself. He was transfigured. He did not transfigure himself. So I did not include those. But anyway, you've got about, give or take however you can, you got about 37 specific miracles recorded in the Gospels. And I'll be glad to send you this list if you want it. But the miracles call for our investigation of them and really trying to figure out, okay, what, how do I interpret miracles? Really, how do I identify the main truth of a miracle? That's really what we're going to work on tonight. And sometimes maybe there are other considerations that will come into play, and we think about, okay, what's the major truth, or how do I identify it? Sometimes maybe it's a thought we want to communicate, and so we make that the focus. I remember hearing about a man who was burdened. His church people weren't helping like he thought they should, so he preached on the miracle of Lazarus, and how Lazarus, when Lazarus came out of the grave, other people had to help unwrap him. And so no doubt there were many people involved to move the stone, unwrap him. And so his focus on the miracle was everybody needs to get involved. And obviously what he's doing there, he's got a thought he wants to communicate, and he's trying to use that miracle to communicate his thought. Number two here, you can see sometimes we do what I call importing, where there's something from another passage in Scripture, and you import that into a passage because you feel like it's teaching the same thing. And so sometimes we will read a passage and think, I think that has about the same truth as this other passage. We kind of import what we already know from the Bible. We import it into the passage we're studying. Sometimes we will highlight a general idea that we know is true and stick with the generality, like Jesus is God or God is good. And we come with a general statement, like somebody might say, okay, Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. Well, what does that teach? Well, it teaches us that Jesus is God. Say, well, okay, it could, but there were Old Testament prophets who also healed people and even raised people from the dead. So is that really what that miracle is addressing? And I think sometimes we might create a sermon outline from a miracle, and then we've got to think of a way to unite the points we've created. And so that's how we come up with the major truth. And what I want to emphasize tonight is that a miracle is a kind of story. And we want to approach a miracle, we want to approach it from the standpoint of it's being a story. And I put together this list of things in a story that you look for or that you analyze and consider, and it's putting these 5 things together, and there are other things you could mention as well, but it's combing through these 5 aspects of a story that in conjunction with each other will often lead you to the main truth or the major truth of a miracle. And I'm not sure there's any specific order here. This is the order that I think is logical, but you could do these in differing orders. So one would be look at the setting, look at the context. Are there any clues? Are there any repeated words? Is there anything about the setting or context we should know? Any connectors that the gospel author makes for us? I would say another thing you want to consider is the main characters in that miracle. Who are the main characters? What makes somebody a main character? Well, one of the key things that makes somebody a main character is if they speak in a miracle. And you've got some miracles that don't have any speech, but a lot of miracles you have speech, and sometimes you have people that don't even talk. Sometimes even somebody who's being healed doesn't really come across as a main character in the miracle in which he's being healed. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But you identify the main characters, and that helps also in isolating the direction of miracles going. Dialogue. This connects to characters, obviously. Dialogue is super important in miracles, especially the first uttered words in a story or in a miracle. And very important in a miracle are the first uttered words in that miracle. We're going to see that a few times here. So many times those words set the direction for the entire miracle. Then number 4 relates to plot, and it's a little more complicated than this, but just keeping things simple is you're looking at the plot and you're trying to say, okay, what's the primary tension? What's the problem in the miracle that the story is solving? And again, if you don't have a problem, you don't have a story, right? I mean, if somebody says, well, I got up to go to work and I got my car and it started, and I got out and there was no traffic, and I got to the first barrier and I had enough money in my card, no problem. And got to work and there was a parking spot, had no problem. Got to work and went to my office and I had a key and no problem. And, I mean, you don't have a story because nothing's happening. And a story has a problem. A story has tension. And what's fascinating in the miracles is sometimes the healing or the activity of the healing or the thing being healed is not really the main tension or the main problem. Sometimes the healing is the platform for the main truth that's being revealed or the main problem that's being addressed. That's a fascinating phenomenon in miracles. And then lastly, the conclusion in a miracle is often super helpful. It gives the author will give his perspective. It'll record the audience's response. And sometimes the audience's response is what should be our response, or maybe what should not be our response. And so the response is intended for us to interact with. But especially the idea of the author's perspective, it's what sometimes they call a narrative point of view, where the author tells you his point of view. And what's key in biblical miracles is that since we're talking about a story that is, the recording of that story is inspired and without error, the point of view of the author is God's point of view of that miracle. It's what he wants us to take away from that miracle. So what I argue is that it's a mixture of these kinds of things: setting, characters, the dialogue, the plot, the conclusion. It's combing through these. Some of these are more significant in some miracles than others. Some miracles don't have dialogue. Some miracles don't really have much of a plot. But it's combing through these and thinking through them and using these as you sift them to let them lead you kind of like a spiral, to kind of help them lead you toward, okay, what's the main truth of a miracle? So what I want to do tonight is I want to practice and try to practice together a little bit. I know it's a little limited here, but I want to practice on 2 miracles that I think are rather, or maybe a little bit more obvious. And we're going to practice on another miracle if we have time that's a little more challenging. So we're going to go to Mark chapter 1. And so if you have a Bible, you might want to go to Mark chapter. We're going to look at the first miracle that's recorded in Mark. And this will be our first example. I'm just going to leave these 5 things up here on the screen. And we're going to reference these as we work through this. So Mark chapter 1 and verse 21 tells us we're getting toward the setting here of this miracle. So they went into Capernaum, the headquarters of Christ's ministry, straightway on the Sabbath day. That's part of our setting. It occurs on the Sabbath day. He entered into the synagogue. So there again's our synagogue. I mean, there's our context. We know when. We know where. He taught, so we know what he's doing. This is all part of our context. And we really don't know yet what's going to be important. Like at this point, we might think, oh, this is a Sabbath day miracle. That's going to be very important. But we're going to see in just a minute, the fact that this miracle took place on the Sabbath day is not crucial in this miracle, because the story doesn't come back to it. So we're not really sure yet what in these clues is going to be important. We're just kind of combing through it, and what is repeated, or if it comes back to it, or if it becomes noteworthy, that's when we start to say, oh, okay, that's an important clue. Okay, so he's teaching. So verse 22, and they were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. And we're going to see here in just a minute that word authority is going to become an important word, because it's repeated. And when something is repeated, that's when you start to realize, okay, that's a clue. So they are astonished that he teaches with authority. This is the response of, you see verse 22, the they. So here's the people, those that are gathered, those at Capernaum, those who are listening. It's their response that's going to be recorded again at the end of the miracle. So it's like, here's the response before the miracle takes place. Wow, he teaches with authority. He does the miracle. The miracle story ends by again recording the response of the people and their astonishment at something else that he does or has authority over. So that's I'm just kind of setting us up for where this is going to head. Verse 23, and there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee, who thou art, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, hold thy peace, and come out of him. And when the unclean spirit had torn him, and cried with a loud voice, he came out of him, and they were all amazed, insomuch that they questioned among themselves, saying, what thing is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority commandeth he even the unclean spirits, and they do obey him. And then verse 28 kind of wraps up the miracle. So if we move from number 1 and talk about main characters, who would be our main characters? Obviously Jesus. He's going to be the main character in any of the miracles, right, that he does. So he's going to be a main character. We would think that this man with an unclean spirit is going to be a main character. And I think we could say he is. But what's interesting to me is he gets really overshadowed by the demon and by the crowd. So the man, verse 23, the man does speak, but what you realize in verse 24 is it's like he's not the one speaking. It's like the demon is using this man as his vocal cords. But you can see from like verse 24, I mean, this is the demon through the man. So like any demon-possessed situation, it's a little bit unclear who's actually speaking. But Jesus, verse 25, is addressing the unclean spirit. And again, you've got, Jesus rebuked him, saying, hold thy peace, come out of him. It's a little bit, but what's interesting to me is when he comes out, verse 26, the focus is on the unclean spirit, and verse 27, the focus is on the crowd. It's really not, doesn't record any response of the man himself. It's like he's overshadowed by the demon and all of that, and then the crowd itself, and you don't really have anything regarding the man himself. Like he gets up, he dusts himself off, he says, thank you, Jesus, for setting me free. I mean, you just don't have anything like that. But what this does do, if you think about, okay, who are the main characters? Well, you've got the crowd, they're there in the background in the response, but you got Jesus, and in some ways the dialogue is between Jesus and this unclean spirit in this man. And that helps when we move to number 3, when we start thinking about the first uttered words. Who speaks first in this miracle? And it's the demon. This is the first recorded speech in the miracle. So what that is setting us up for is we've got, okay, so what does the unclean spirit say? And you can see in the King James Version, it's got "let us alone," which is a form of a command. That there's actually some question whether it's a little tiny two-letter word in Greek. It's a little question as to whether that word is there, actually, in terms of manuscripts. But what you clearly do have, is the demon speaking up and his statement, "What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth?" And "what have we to do with thee" can be almost translated like, okay, what do we have in common, or why are you bothering us? Or it can almost have the idea of, okay, why are you disturbing us? And you've got the demon speaking up and speaking his mind. And that's how this miracle starts in terms of speech. Well, let's move to number 4. Let's see if we can help ourselves out a little bit here. So the demon speaks. So here's this, and the plot is like the progress of a story. So like, what's the tension, or what's the problem in this story? Like, what is the story resolving, or where do you feel the most tension, or what tension is being created? And I would say that if you consider the first dialogue, and then if you consider Jesus' words in verse 25, your main tension, your main problem, so to speak, is it's like this unclean demon versus Jesus. This is the first recorded miracle of Jesus where he casts out an unclean spirit. If I remember, I didn't double check this tonight, but I think I remember from last Tuesday or last week when I was looking at this. This is the 4th miracle that Jesus does. This is the first one. So in other words, he, in his public ministry, he has never cast out an unclean spirit. This is the first time. So you've got a confrontation between Jesus and an unclean spirit. The unclean spirit speaks first and says, okay, what do you have to do with us? Why are you bothering us? And possibly he says to him, leave us alone. And it's almost like you're setting yourself up in the synagogue setting. Who's in charge and who gives the commands? Is it the unclean spirit, or is it Jesus of Nazareth? The demon speaks first, and then Jesus speaks, and Jesus gives a very clear command to this demon. And the tension, so to speak, or the problem that's going to be resolved, is to make clear who's in charge of who, or who has authority over who. Does the unclean spirit have authority in this situation, or does Jesus have authority in this situation? And of course, what you find out by verse 26 is that the unclean spirit obeys the commands of Jesus. That Jesus gives the commands, and the demon obeys. And that's like your tension or problem that's being resolved in the story. Well, then you move down to the conclusion. And a conclusion in a story is very important. A good storyteller puts part of his meaning, or a main part of his meaning, at the end of the story. That's why he's a good storyteller. He doesn't tell the point too soon. And when you look at the end of the story, verse 27, you're back to the crowds, and they're amazed again. So they were amazed back in verse 22 at his teaching. And now they're amazed at something different when they say, for with authority. There's our same word. So earlier it's like, okay, wow, this man teaches with authority. But then after the miracle, wow, this man has authority to command unclean spirits, and they obey him. And then the miracle ends. It's like the miracle, the conclusion is the author letting you in on the audience's response to what Jesus did, that they come away impressed with Jesus' authority over unclean spirits. So when I put all of that together, You've got the context where they've got authority. They're amazed at Jesus' authority and teaching. You got the main characters, and what you see almost right away is it's Jesus and the man with the unclean spirit, but the unclean spirit is the one who seems to be doing the actual talking, and the unclean spirit is the one that Jesus commands to go out. And verse 3, when I see the dialogue, I see a confrontation taking place. And number 4, the tension, the problem is, okay, who's in charge? Who has authority in a situation like this? And of course, we see Jesus cast out the unclean spirit, and the conclusion, the author says, okay, this is what the people saw. This is what they said. This man has authority to command unclean spirits, and they obey him. And I would say that's the major truth of this miracle, that Jesus has authority over unclean spirits. And we maybe sometimes forget how much of a blessing that would be to a people or a situation where you do have a demon. And sometimes we live in our sophisticated world settings, but we all realize there are parts of our globe or cultures that have a lot of demon possession. And you've got a missionary like, say, I just forgot his name, not Jonathan Goforth, not Hudson Taylor, but the guy with the Lisus, Beyond the Ranges. Can't think of his name right now. But anyway, the man who gave his life for the Lisu people. And he talks about the struggle of getting his people freed of demonic oppression. And they were so afraid of the unclean spirits that they would go back to them. And even people that have professed faith, when sickness came, they would go to the witch doctor. And the witch doctor would say, you need to sacrifice a pig. The demons are angry. And they would sacrifice a pig. And the man would recover from his sickness when they sacrificed the pig. And so they were bound by these unclean spirits. So just making the point that a miracle like this with a truth like this really does have a value in helping us realize Jesus really does have authority over unclean spirits, over the demon world. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And we don't need to be afraid of demons or demonic oppression because Jesus has authority over them. So I would say that's like the major truth of this miracle. So let's move on. Let's do another one. Let's move one chapter over. Let's go to Mark chapter 2. And these are ones I think are a little easier to unpack. Then we're going to head to John chapter 2 and work on the turning the water to wine. So let's see what happens there. Mark chapter 2 is where Jesus heals a paralytic. And there's a few things that happen, and again, to get the context or setting, we almost have to keep reading, where after the miracle we just looked at, you've got verse 30, Simon's wife's mother has a fever, and Jesus heals her. That's the second miracle recorded by Mark in his book. Then you've got a cluster of miracles that are done, so all these people are coming, and he's casting out devils, and he's healing various sicknesses. And then verse 39 mentions him leaving Capernaum, and 38, 39, he's preaching in other places, and while he's out there, a leper comes to him, and Jesus heals the leper. And then chapter 2, verse 1 brings him back to Capernaum. So a few things have happened in between. So he comes back to Capernaum after some days, and it's noise that he was in the house. So word gets out that this healer, this man who heals every single disease thrown at him, and who casts out every single unclean spirit that confronts him, or he is confronted with. He casts out all of those spirits. He heals every disease. This man is back. And the word gets out, and that house gets packed. And that's, of course, what the story goes on to say. Straightway, many were gathered together, insomuch there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word unto them. And they came unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was. When they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? And immediately, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether it is easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk, but that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He said to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise and take up thy bed and go thy way to thy house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. So if we take this miracle and we work through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you got your setting, your context. Well, he's back in Capernaum. It's noise that he's there. Verse 2, there's no room for anybody as he's preaching. I would say the context suggests that it is crowded like that, not just because of his preaching, but because of his healing. The word has gotten out about who this man is. So they're all there. And of course, you have these four who have I'm just going to call him a friend. It doesn't really say that he's a friend, but you've got these four who have an acquaintance or relative or friend, and they want him to be healed. And they've got verse 5, it's their faith that Jesus sees, and maybe also the man that's actually paralyzed, but it's their faith, so it's plural. And they've got the faith that Jesus can heal their friend, and so they bring their friend. And when they see the place is full, they find a way to dig through the roof. And, good thing this wasn't Singapore, right? With all those 13-story, 20-story flats. I mean, how are you going to get that guy down to the first story, right? But anyway, they find a way to get this man before Christ. So identify main characters. Well, obviously Jesus. We would assume that this man with the palsy, he's the sick man. We might assume the four friends that are bringing these four men that are bringing their friend to Jesus. They never speak. The four friends never speak. The man with palsy, the paralyzed man, he never speaks either. Jesus speaks, and you've got some scribes who speak. And it kind of makes you walk away when you look at, and I'm just kind of keeping us moving here because of time, but you walk away thinking, okay, it's almost like the man who was healed, it's almost like he's not one of the principal main characters. It's like your main character is Jesus, and then the guys who do the talking are the scribes. And again, the man, all that's recorded is the man got up and he took his bed and he walked off. It doesn't really record his response at all. Again, it's the people who are amazed, and it's the scribes who say Jesus is blaspheming. So when you start to analyze the main characters, you realize, okay, so really the man with the palsy, he's getting healed and he's important, and the friends are important, but the friends disappear. I mean, after verse 5, when Jesus saw their faith, that's the last reference to the friends in a specific way, and the story moves on. And it kind of makes you think, okay, so like you've got Jesus, and obviously he's the main character, and then you've got these scribes that are interacting with Jesus, and Jesus interacts with them. And it's almost like the man who's paralyzed, he's just the platform for the main spectacle or the main show that's about to take place. And you see that more when you get to the dialogue. So number 3, who speaks the first uttered words in this miracle? And it's verse 5. And it's Jesus. And those first words are not at all what you expect. And what you expect is Jesus to say, your faith has healed you. Or get up and walk. Or I say to you, your paralysis is gone. Take your bed and go home. But instead, you've got this very curious situation where in verse 5, Jesus sees their faith. He sees the faith of these four, their faith that he can heal their friend. And Jesus looks down at this man and he says to him, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." That's the first uttered words, and that dialogue takes us in a completely different direction than what we thought. And that really leads us into number 4, which again is, as you go through the plot, what's the tension? What's the problem? And in this miracle, the real tension or problem comes into focus when Jesus says, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee," and now you've got these scribes that begin reasoning in their hearts. The real problem is not how to get the roof off. The real problem is not that the room is crowded. That's just like the setting. That's getting the story going. Let you know a little that helps you see the extent of their faith. That they were determined that they were going to get their friend to Jesus. Didn't matter how they had to do it, because they knew if they got their friend to Jesus, Jesus would heal them. So you had that faith. But the real problem, the real tension comes about when Jesus says, "Son, thy sins are forgiven thee." And then you have these scribes, and they begin saying, "This man is blaspheming." And Jesus perceives their thoughts, and he says, "Okay, so what do you think is easier? Do you think it's easier to say your sins are forgiven, or do you think it's easier to say get up and walk?" And they were thinking that it's easier to say your sins are forgiven because there's nothing visible. Any human being can say to another human being, "Your sins are forgiven." And there's nothing visible. There's nothing for you to see. And so they probably thought that was easier. And Jesus is saying, "Okay, I'm going to show you that I have the authority to forgive sin. I'm going to heal this man." And the logic behind this is, if Jesus really has power from God and he has just blasphemed, then he has no power from God to raise a paralyzed man. If he does have the power to raise a paralyzed man, then he has not blasphemed. And he does have the authority to forgive sins. And if he does have the authority to forgive sins, then Jesus is God. That's the logical progression of this miracle. So that's like the tension is, okay, does Jesus have the authority to forgive sin? That's the tension. That's the problem that this miracle is resolving. There's no question Jesus can heal this friend. Jesus healed everybody around earlier in chapter 1. There's no question about that. The problem is, okay, can this man forgive sin? And what I love about this is it's almost like Jesus sees their faith and he wants to take their faith a little bit deeper. Like he looks at these friends, he sees their faith, they know he can heal, and it's almost like Jesus thinking to himself, okay, I'm going to take them deeper. I'm going to take them beyond the reach of their faith. I'm going to take them into the spiritual realm, and I'm going to show them that not only can I heal their friend, but I can forgive his sin. And that's further than their faith in him had ever been stretched. Well, that leads to the conclusion, and of course, in the conclusion, you've got Jesus saying to this man, after this conversation with these scribes and others that are there, he says, verse 11, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. Verse 12, he gets up. Jesus has power. He did not blaspheme. And the people are amazed, and they glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. And they walk away going, don't know what to think about this. This man forgave somebody's sins, and then he raised him from his bed and he walked away. Not sure how to process this. So, what would you say is the major truth of this miracle? Context of a crowded house, everybody knows Jesus can heal this man. His friends know he can, at least. But the dialogue is focused on whether Jesus can forgive sin. That's the problem. That's what the people go away amazed over. Your repeated words are related to forgiveness of sin. I would say that the major truth of this miracle is that Jesus has the authority to forgive sin. That Jesus can forgive sin. And I think, again, that a miracle like this has a valid application, because I think sometimes people come to Jesus for the same reason that the friends did. That people come to Jesus because he meets their physical needs, or they want Jesus to meet their physical needs. And they view Jesus as some kind of a healer or miracle worker who's going to pay their next bill, or who's going to help them buy their next flat or a larger flat, or he's going to heal their sickness. And they view Jesus as a kind of a rabbit's foot that they can rub and pray, and he's going to provide physical healing. But what Jesus is doing in this miracle is he's taking their faith a little bit deeper, that really his primary mission was not just to deliver people from their physical illnesses. He came to deliver people from their sin. And that's the real realm of his authority. He has authority over the physical realm because he has authority over the spiritual realm. He has authority over the results of sin, like sickness, death, disease, demonic oppression. He has authority over the results of sin because he has the authority to forgive sin or cleanse sin or deal with sin. And so he's taking them a little bit deeper in their journey of faith. I think that's what Jesus wants to do with me, with many of us. He wants us to look past what he can do for us physically, and he wants us to look to what he can do for us spiritually, and especially the matter of forgiveness of sin. I think we could emphasize that. And I remember when I was in Cambodia several years ago, I was at a Wednesday night prayer meeting, and I was speaking on something, I forget, and then the people started giving testimonies, and they all talked about all the problems since they became a Christian. Oh, life is, so much persecution. Life is so hard since I left Buddhism, became a Christian, and so many problems. And so finally I said, so then why did you become a Christian? Or I said something like, why don't you just go back to Buddhism? If there's so many problems, why don't you just go back? And they said, well, because in Jesus we finally found forgiveness for our sins. And I thought, yeah, they got it. That's why he is worth following, regardless of all the persecution. Well, let's try one more. And I don't know if let's see if we can finish. Let's go to John chapter 2. This is a tough one. And I don't know if I have fully cracked this nut or not. But it's beautiful. So let's give it a try. This is John 2. This is Jesus' first recorded miracle. And starts in the first verse of chapter 2. And number 1, as you think about setting context, and the third day, there was a marriage in Cana. Well, if you think back to some of our earlier lectures, this connects to that week, the week when the eternal word was revealed to Israel. This is the climax of that week. This is the last day of that week that John attaches as he kind of takes us on a journey from one day to another, which he doesn't do this hardly anywhere. I think the next time he does this is toward the Passion Week of Christ. So he doesn't do this very often. He takes us on a journey almost day by day, and this is the climax of that week when the eternal word was revealed to Israel. So on the third day, so this is connected to what preceded. There's a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Well, I guess I'm getting ahead here. That's really a main character, but Mary is not in any other miracles of Jesus, and she's not mentioned by name at least. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, when they lacked wine, we would say, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, they have no wine. That's your first recorded words. So, working through this a little bit quickly here. So context. Well, this is attached to that week. It's like the climax. It's the last day of that so-called week. Main characters. Well, we're looking especially for people who speak. Mary speaks. Jesus speaks. You've got the ruler of the feast who's going to speak. The disciples are there, but it's pretty clear that your main characters are Jesus and Mary. His disciples are mentioned at the very end as well as the beginning. I would include them. The ruler of the feast is going to make a very important observation. Those are some of our main characters. 3, what do they say? Well, what's the first uttered words in this story? Verse 3, they're spoken by Mary. And Mary says, they have no wine. Now the question is, how do you process those words? What is she saying to Jesus? And Jesus answers her, and this is part of the dialogue in verse 4. Jesus says to her, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" Very similar words to what the unclean spirit said to Jesus in Mark chapter 1. What do I have to do with you? Why are you bothering me? Mine hour is not yet come. And then his mother saith unto the servants, whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And then Jesus does a miracle. So you've got a dialogue here between Mary. Mary comes to Jesus and she says, they have no wine. And then Jesus makes this comment to her that to us almost sounds disrespectful. Woman. I mean, I don't know if I've ever called my mother woman. Woman. What have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not come. And then surprisingly, Mary says in verse 5, it's like she backs off and she says to the servants, okay, whatever he says, you do it. So it's up to him. Well, 4, if we move on to the idea of tension or problem, what is this miracle? What's the tension or what's the problem? And it's almost like the lack of wine is again going to be the platform from which a larger drama is taking place. And I think that one of the keys to understanding Mary's words in verse 3 is the way Jesus responds in verse 4. Like sometimes in order to understand what somebody says, you have to look at the response to that. So Mary says, they have no wine. And then Jesus comes out with a statement that seems a little, on the edge of disrespectful. Woman, what have I to do with you? Why are you bothering me? My hour has not yet come. And when you consider his response to what she said, I think it helps us in understanding what she said or what she meant by what she said. Meaning something like this. Number 1, her statement is really an implicit request, right? She's really asking, she's not just saying, they have no wine, and she wants Jesus to say, well, that's interesting, thank you for telling me. She's saying that because she's really requesting him to do something. I would say on a second level is that request or that statement, which is an implicit request, expresses her faith in him. Now, Jesus has not, as far as we know, Jesus has not done any miracles to this point. There's no recorded miracle of Christ to this point. So Mary doesn't have any specific miracle that she can go back to necessarily, but she has a faith in him that he can do something about this. And I kind of wonder if part of this relates to the fact that this is that week in which he was revealed to Israel, and there are some things that have been happening in that week. This is when John the Baptist has been pointing his disciples to Jesus. This is when Jesus saw Nathanael under the fig tree. This is that week. Some of these things that were happening, Jesus' baptism, for example, that had taken place sometime before that, 40 days or so before, because you have the wilderness temptation. So, some of these things had reached Mary, that these things, Jesus had been baptized, some of these things had been happening. So, she's processing these. Mary has more understanding of who Jesus is than maybe anybody else alive at this point. John the Baptist maybe has some, but Mary knew about the virgin birth. Mary knew about the angels. Mary knew about the guidance of her husband Joseph when they had to leave Bethlehem and go to Egypt and come out of Egypt and then not settle in Judea and go back to Nazareth. And so Mary has all of this revelation. So it's her faith in him. But I also think, and this is based on verse 4, I also think that not only is her statement an implicit request, like, Jesus, they don't have any wine. Could you do something? It's not only an expression of belief, like I know you could, but I almost think that the way she says it to him is kind of a very slight criticism. Almost like a slight accusation. And I'm getting that from the way Jesus responds. It's like she's saying to him, Jesus, they don't have any wine now. Like as if she's saying to him, you could have done something about this before they ran out. And that's not too similar. That's not too different from what Mary and Martha did to Jesus later on in his ministry. When they come to Jesus and they say, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And it's like there's a very slight accusation or a slight criticism, like, you could have stopped this. And I kind of wonder if that's what Mary is doing in verse 3, is this a little bit of a criticism, like, okay, so now it's happened. They don't have any wine. And I think we could assume that those in the know would have known that the wine was running low in the situation. And it may even have been that Mary knew about this situation earlier. It may have been that Jesus knew about the situation, that they were running low on wine. Okay, that's not recorded, so we don't know. That's speculation. But Jesus' response is what indicates to me that her words are a slight criticism. They don't have any wine, Jesus. Like as if she's saying, you could have stepped in maybe, and maybe you could have done something, and they would not have run out of wine, and they would not be so embarrassed because of this. And I think there's a slight criticism there because of the way Jesus responds. And Jesus is not disrespectful. He is straightforward with her, and what he's saying to her is crucial. This again is part of the week when the eternal word was revealed to Israel. There's a lot of things that have changed since the last time that Mary saw Jesus. Just assuming Jesus has been in Judea. He's now back in Galilee. He's reunited again with his mother. And what Jesus is basically saying in his response to her is he's kind of putting a little distance, like he's saying, okay, woman, there's a little different relationship now between you and me. Woman. He's not being disrespectful. This is the way he addresses her from the cross. Woman, behold thy son. He's not being disrespectful. What he's doing is he is expressing the new relationship that exists between them. I think in addition to that, he is suggesting to her that he is going to do something, or he can do something, and he will respond to her faith, but it is not her place to dictate how or when. And that is essential to the ministry of Jesus, because Jesus could not do miracles at the request of his mother. He has got to do miracles when it is the will of his Father. And that's essentially what he's saying to her. He's saying, listen, woman, the reason I have not done anything is because my time to do that had not yet come. But what he's not saying is that his time will not come, if that makes sense. There's something in the way Jesus said it that indicated that his time had come or was about to come, almost as if Jesus was waiting until they had run out of wine before it was his time. Because Jesus doesn't want to help a low wine situation. Jesus wants to help a no wine situation. And you see that at the end of the miracle in verse 11 when it says that Jesus revealed his glory. What he's going to do in this miracle is reveal to his disciples, he's going to reveal his glory. He's going to take off the veil for about the first time to his early disciples, and they're going to see behind the mask of Jewish humanity, they're going to see who he really is. And there's something in the way he says it that indicates to his mother, okay, the time had not yet come. The time was not yet coming, but the time for him to act is approaching near. And she turns to the servants and she says, whatever he says to you, you do it. And it's like what you come away with is that, okay, Jesus determines when and Jesus determines how he does a miracle. It's not his mother who determines that, it's Jesus who determines that. And this is a really important truth if you think about like the country where I live right now in the Philippines, which is about 80% Roman Catholic. And there's a lot of Roman Catholics who pray to Mary instead of Jesus. And they pray to Mary because they're thinking, and kind of like a story like this, are thinking is, okay, what son would ever deny his mother? And if you can get Mary to petition Jesus for you, then Jesus is going to give you what you ask for. And what this miracle is really doing is turning that kind of thinking on its head. And it's really saying, no. Jesus is saying to his mother, he's saying, woman, there's a little different relationship. And I will respond to your faith, but there's a reason why I have not done anything, because my time had not yet come. And it's not for you to tell me when or to tell me how I do a miracle. And you see Mary submit to that and say, okay, whatever he says. And she has to come to him like a disciple, just like any other disciple comes to Jesus by faith and says, my daughter is sick, or my son is sick, or my servant is sick. She's got to come like any other disciple and bring her faith to Jesus. And then, of course, the miracle goes on. And so I would say, number 4, that's your tension or your problem is related to, okay, so now it's up to Jesus as to how and to when he's going to do something. And then in the miracle, he does it. And he makes a wine that is far beyond the quality of what you normally served at the end of a wedding feast. And the speech of that ruler is important because it indicates a miracle really had taken place. He recognized a miracle. The servants recognized a miracle. And very important, and this is number 5, very important for the story, is not so much the ruler. I mean, he's important because he verifies the miracle. And what's important is not so much the servants, but verse 11, what's important is that the disciples realized a miracle had taken place. And Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed on him. And what you've got at the end of this week, again, the week when the eternal word was revealed to Israel, at the climactic day, the climaxing day of that week, Jesus, for the first time, really, reveals who he is to his disciples. And he lifts the veil behind his Jewish humanity, and he shows his power or his glory or his essence. And I would say that's getting us toward the major truth of this miracle. And in my own thoughts, I summarize it like this, that Jesus determines when and how he reveals who he is. And Jesus determines when and how he reveals who he is, and he reveals his glory to his disciples, and they believe on him. And that's the response that Jesus wants. Jesus wants his glory and who he is. He wants that to be unveiled in such a way that it cements or solidifies or deepens the faith of his disciples. And that's what he does on this occasion. They walk away even more than they were. They walk away believers. Why? Because they saw his glory. And they saw his glory because he chose to reveal it. His mother didn't choose to reveal it. He chose to reveal his glory. He determined the when and the how of revealing who he was. And I would say that's the truth of the major truth of this miracle. So that brings us to 8:59. And somebody had a question here about Lazarus. I would say that when you get to Lazarus, what you've got is you've got these statements, I am the resurrection and the life. And you've got some of Jesus' explanations. And so I would tie in the miracle of Lazarus, I would tie it in to some of those express statements where Jesus is revealing that he is the resurrection and the life. And anybody who believes in him shall not, what does he say? I forget the exact, he shall not die. It's striking words that are mentioned in there. Anyway, I would say that it's something like that is what I would pull out as the main truth of that. Yeah, and whosoever liveth, Jesus said, this is 11:25, John, I'm the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And then verse 26, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? And I would say statements like that are getting to the heart of that miracle. So I would love to hear from you. Try this fivefold. And then what I would suggest is this: kind of think through those things, the context, the characters, dialogue. Okay, what's the main problem? What's the tension? How does it conclude? And then see if you can develop a major truth of the miracle. State it. I mean, I like to make a statement in like 10 words or less, so it's kind of short and meaningful. And I would say, get the major truth, then go back to the miracle and say, okay, what kind of points can I make that will lead people to that major truth? And that's how you would develop a teaching outline or a sermon outline on a miracle. Is try to get that major truth, and then go back and see if there's any some points you want to make that would help lead somebody, lead the congregation or lead your audience to the main truth. Or maybe even going through these 5 steps with them and say, okay, let's just look at these things in the story, and we're going to use these to push us toward the main truth. And then, of course, obviously, you want to make application. Truth exists to be applied and lived. So, okay, it's 9:02, and I don't want to keep you beyond the stated.
Can I ask verse 11 for chapter 2, wedding, the miracle?
Yeah.
It says that manifested forth his glory. Is it related to the turning the water into wine, or he's something not related to this?
Yeah, no. That, in other words, he revealed his glory by turning the water into wine.
Okay.
So going
to this glory,
yeah, that was a revelation of his glory, that he could take a no wine situation where there is no wine, and that's clear, and there's no wine, and he takes water pots, and we didn't work through this very carefully together, but he takes water pots. These are water pots for purification. There's not a drop of anything from the vine. There's no wine. There's no anything from the vine. There's nothing in those pots. They are water pots for purification. Okay. And he turns that into wine.